Welcome to Conversations That Matter. Joining me, as always, is Mike Minier. Mike, who's our guest today?
Hi, Stu. Today is Tzeporah Berman. She's been around the environmental movement in British Columbia and Canada for over 20 years. Interesting story. Tzeporah started her career and her work in the environmental movement in BC through one of the largest acts of civil disobedience. Was willing to get arrested to protect the Great Bear Rainforest, the Clayoquot Sound. And over the last couple of decades, has continued her environmental activism, but really shifted her messaging to include the economic imperative of fighting climate change, and has been honored by the University of British Columbia with an honorary doctorate, has been called an enemy of the state by a premier of British Columbia, honored by Corporate Knights as one of the best women in sustainability. So she seems to be this interesting force speaking from the environmental movement that has both been accepted within the economic argument, but also certainly earning a lot of quote-unquote enemies in both the environmental movement and the economic and political sides of the equation.
Well, it's interesting about Tzeporah is that she has no trouble stating it the way that she sees it. So many other people will figure out where they fit into an argument, and that's the way that they'll present it. With Tzeporah, you know that it's full on her, it is her belief, and she's willing to go right to the nth degree to let you understand her perspective.
And she's also clear about what needs to be done. She'll cite the myriad reports about the sky falling around climate change, but her position is very clear. We need to act now, and we need the political will. In other words, our elected officials have to do something about it and lead, as she says. And number two, the citizenry, the public, has to be engaged. So it can't just be government making decisions to solve this. It has to be people changing their lives and pushing for change. And in a way, there's lots of people that write reports and talk about climate change. This is a woman who actually went out and got arrested in the legal system and has stood on her principles and risked her career in a way.
I think it's important to point out that she's not all, everything's going in the wrong direction. She is also optimistic. She cites a wide variety of advances in that conversation that I had with her. It was a very interesting conversation.
And one of the things that she talks about, one of the positive trend lines, I guess, is the potential for clean energy is here now. When she got her honorary degree a couple years ago at UBC, she told the graduates there that we're at a new tipping point moment, that we have the technology, we have the capacity to use greener, cleaner energy. We just have to have the will to do it. She says that for every dollar we don't invest in clean energy today, we'll spend $4 down the road dealing with the ramifications of not getting off of carbon-emitting fuels.
Well, let's go to that conversation now. Welcome.
Thank you.
Where are we at, from your perspective, on the climate? Are we in crisis? Are we starting to get things under control? Are we in denial?
I think we're all of those things. For me, my kind of climate reckoning moment came at the United Nations Climate Conference in Bali years ago. And, I'd been doing some research and understanding that maybe I should start working on this, and this was getting really serious. And there I was sitting in the audience, and the Secretary General of the United Nations stood up and he said, if we don't reach an agreement here to dramatically reduce and eventually eliminate all fossil fuel use and production, then we are dooming humanity to oblivion. And I remember sitting there with my pen poised, turning to the woman next, did he just say dooming humanity? I've been called a lot of names in 20 years of working on environmental issues, hysterical, etc. And I've never said anything that radical. And here was the Secretary General of the United Nations speaking to the heads of 120 nations. And that was the moment for me when I thought, this is getting really serious. Like, what is he talking about? And I started doing my research in earnest and working on climate change entirely. And the reason I said we're kind of in all of those places that you mentioned is because there is now no question from the majority of the world's governments, the World Bank, the IMF, the majority of the world's scientists that climate change is one of the greatest challenges humanity has ever faced, and that unless we address it quickly, that we will destabilize the climate to such an extent that the majority of the world's population will not be able to meet basic needs. That's the conclusion of, for example, the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change report, which was signed off on by over 100 countries, was worked on by 3,000 scientists. So that's the place we're in. But at the same time, we're already starting to address it. We have seen more technological advances in the last 2 years on renewable energies than we've seen in the last 20. We've seen more market investment in renewable energy around the world than we've ever seen before. Last year, we had more investment in renewable energy globally than for electricity production than we did in oil, coal, and nuclear combined.
So people are listening then.
So the markets have started to tip. And the price of solar has gone down 400% in 24 months. So that changes everything. Because at the point that solar actually competes with coal, it has price parity, why build a coal plant? Because then you're dependent on a finite resource. So there's now good economic reasons to move to renewables, besides all the good reasons around fighting climate change.
So we take a look at what Elon Musk at Tesla is doing with
Exactly.
the development of storage systems for the home, so that if you don't have sun, you can still contain or retain some of that energy that you've been able to develop through solar.
Yeah.
Is technology the answer? Or do we go, nope, we got to stop and go and shift backwards? And I think that if we have to say, no, we got to stop our development, we're going to run into a tremendous amount of resistance.
The big answer to a lot of the climate crisis is technological developments. It is also lifestyle to a certain extent, because it's a lifestyle change, even if you've got great high-speed rail, which when I was living in Europe, we did. Mm-hmm. It's still a lifestyle change to say to the 4 kids, no, you can't pack all of that because we're going on a train. You're not going in a car, right? There are some changes that need to be made. But we know now that we have the technologies today to meet the climate change challenge. The new efficient technologies mean that we'll reduce our energy use without, having to go back to living in cabins in the dark.
I was reading with interest this week that in China, they have developed the world's first hydrogen-powered tram. Mm-hmm. The only emission, water. That's
right?
it. China. So when we take a look at China, let's take a step back and take a look at sort of the arc of development in North America and European technological development. It was this long kind of arc like this, where we started to get to a point where we were interacting better with Mother Nature. In China, they start off and they are using antiquated technologies, and they're going in a way that is it's harmful, there's no doubt about it. But they're racing ahead at lightning speed, moving beyond that.
Yeah.
Do you have hope in Asia when you see what's happening there?
Yeah, I really do, because I think what we're seeing is a lot of, in China, as well as many emerging economies, they're starting to leap right over the fossil fuel era, because now they have electric cars, because now they have the potential for hydrogen trains, high-speed rail, electric high-speed rail across the country, renewable energy. China is the largest producer of solar panels now. They're putting up a wind turbine. If you look at how many wind turbines went up last year in China, it's 1 every hour. That's how fast wind energy is going up in the country.
Okay, but at the same time, I had heard that up until just like in the last couple of months, they were building 2 coal plants a week, 2 coal-fired energy plants a week. But now all of a sudden, they're not.
Oh, there's no question that there is, that China has had for many years a kind of all of the above energy strategy. They needed it all because they were growing so quickly. But there's been pushback in China because of the health implications of all of that coal. Mm-hmm. The coal ash that is poisoning communities, et cetera. And not only is there pushback, but at the same time, now solar is starting to be at cost or cheaper. And they're not going to have to import coal in order to feed those coal plants then, solar. And they don't have the dramatic consequences of the oil spills or the other related consequences of fossil fuels, right? Like a solar spill, well, it's just a sunny day, right?
That's good.
And so now I think what we're starting to see is a shift, and China is recognizing that that's going to have an impact on international politics. What I'm finding interesting is the interplay between the markets and policy. So in September, the U.S. and China made an agreement on climate, where China set really aggressive goals for reducing climate pollution, and the U.S. increased their goals. China wouldn't have done that if it wasn't projecting out to the future and seeing more electric vehicles, more high-speed rail, more renewables as having a lot more promise than depending on oil and coal.
So where do we go from here to where we need to be? How do we get there? Does it start top down, or does it start like bottom up, or is it a combination of everything?
I think the most important thing is for governments, all level of governments, municipal, state and provincial and federal, to be setting climate targets and to be putting caps on the amount of pollution that can be emitted. The Canadian federal government promised for 6 years straight to put in place oil and gas regulations, and then didn't. And then this year just said, well, it would be crazy. We're not going to regulate them. Okay. So we need the government to actually regulate. Because if you're building more pipelines and you're expanding the oil sands or putting up more coal plants, you're committing your economy for the next 40 or 50 years into fossil fuels. It's not just about today's decisions, it's about today's infrastructure decisions and what that means in terms of both the economy and climate.
Okay, but how does that work? I take a look at British Columbia, where they introduced a carbon tax a number of years ago under Gordon Campbell's government.
Yeah.
What's that done? Like how?
It's working. So it's reducing.
Tell me how it's working.
It's dramatically reducing pollution. Our GDP has gone up, and the impact of a carbon price, when it costs more to pollute, that stimulates innovation. So we saw a number of high-tech and clean-tech companies come in and start bidding for contracts. Oh, hey, UBC, you're going to have these huge costs. Well, it would be cheaper for you to put in this geothermal plant. Then you wouldn't be dependent on this, and you could heat your buildings this way. We've seen a dramatic influx of high-tech and clean-tech companies into British Columbia. And so now BC is one of the leading regions for kind of a hub of high-tech and clean-tech. Do you know we employ now more people in Canada in clean-tech, clean energy, and high-tech than we do in oil and gas? That's the future.
That's a positive thing about Canada.
No, and it is. And it's because of BC. And it's because of Ontario. And so you can see how the markets are led by policy. So in Ontario, we got a Green Energy Act, which stimulated renewables across the province. And then we got a Premier Wynne, who came in and said they're recommitting to climate targets, who's looking at a carbon price. So now you have all these renewable companies moving into Ontario and into BC. The problem we have in Canada is that because we have no federal targets or federal policies that would kind of harmonize what's happening across the country, we have it's a bit of a dog's breakfast of policies across the country, and our markets are not big enough to get a lot of the big players in. So California has targets that are extremely aggressive. They've said that they're going to have a 50% reduction in oil by 2030 for the entire state. And they have strong climate targets. And because there's 30 million people there, it's basically the same size economy as all of Canada.
Yes.
That they have this explosion of clean tech and clean energy and investment into the country. All those big players, the GE, et cetera, they want to invest in where they know that they have some certainty, and the policies create certainty. So we need our politicians to step up.
Do you think that we're going to actually see the so-called hydrogen highway become a reality? Because it got stalled. It looked like it had promise coming out of the starting gate when you go back 10 or so years. But then it didn't get adopted. And
I don't know. I'm not a hydrogen expert, but what I see right now is far more promise in electric vehicles and long-range electric vehicles and plug-in infrastructure. Huge promise in high-speed rail. It should already be happening. We should be able to go Vancouver, Seattle, Montreal to Windsor. You know, you live in Europe, you get on a train in Amsterdam after work and you're in Paris just after dinner, you know. It's so fast, it's so easy, they're always used, it's reducing emissions enormously. And so I think we should be looking at high-speed rail, and we should be looking at electric vehicles and electrifying our ports as a priority. Whether or not hydrogen has much promise, I couldn't tell you. It's not my field.
I guess we also have to be careful about the way that we develop that electric energy, though.
Of course.
You know, hydroelectric here is a renewable resource, but when you move into Alberta, for instance, they're burning coal.
But Alberta has some of the best renewable energy capacity in all of North America. And geothermal, wind, even solar. And so there's a number of proposals on the table for Alberta to phase out coal and start increasing renewable energy. And that would change the face of carbon politics, I think.
Okay,
in
so
Canada.
that's starting at the government level. They're able to create some kind of a legislative environment that, as you say, puts pressure on markets and spurs innovation. Let's bring it down to like the individual. What can we do that are practical things that can help to start to put pressure on those markets going the other way?
Well, we have power in a couple of ways, right? We have power as parents and teachers and leaders. We have power as voters, and we have power as consumers. And we can do things in all of those three buckets. I mean, I'm a parent, and I think children learn what they live. And so if you're making decisions, you know, for every holiday to jump on a plane and fly off to Palm Springs or Mexico or Hawaii, and you're not having that discussion with your kids, well, then carbon doesn't matter. You're, as a family, not really taking it seriously, and that's what they learn. I think that whether it's in our work lives or in our personal lives, we need to start recognizing that there are basic limits in the world, and that the amount of carbon that we produce is well over what is safe for our kids. And that has to be part of our conversation. So I think how much we fly, what we eat. You know, if we eat a high meat diet, that's way more carbon intensive. If you're flying in wine from Italy, if you're eating a lot of tropical fruits, all of these things are flown in. So at our household, we've been trying to eat a lot more vegetarian, a lot more local and organic, to reduce our own carbon footprint, to fly less as a family, to really just have the conversation with our kids so they know it. We recently built our own house, and it's passive solar, so the majority of our energy comes from the sun. But if it's cold in Vancouver, you put a sweater on, right? Remember that, when we used to, instead of just turning up our thermostats? So I think homeowners and families need to really think about this. Whether you're renting or owning your own home, there are ways to make it more energy efficient, so you're using less energy to conserve, to think about how you're getting around the city. I mean, in Vancouver, I think this transit referendum is critical. That's going on right now. People can vote right through to May. I would say saying yes to that transit referendum is incredibly important, because we're going to have 1 million more people in the Vancouver area, and we need to be able to know that our kids can safely get on a bus at night, and they think about that as part of the way they move about the city. But but as an individual, I think the most important thing that we can do is make sure that our MLAs and our MPs know that we care. We're not going to get good climate policy in this country until they think that there's support for them making hard choices, and that there's consequences for their inaction.
I feel like there's going to be steps forward and there will be steps back, and that we have to accept that that's part of the process.
Sure.
You know, I'm starting to hear people say, I don't want to hear the complaining any longer. I want to hear the solutions.
That's right. We also have to remember, though, that we have about 8 years. We know that you can debate and negotiate all you want, but the atmosphere doesn't negotiate. There's some laws of physics here, and carbon dioxide gets trapped in the atmosphere and becomes a kind of almost blanket above the earth. So we're at about 400 parts per million today. We know that if we get to about 450 parts per million, then it's going to be much more difficult to stop. According to the majority of the world's scientists, at that point, climate change becomes runaway, because there are other feedback loops. We've lost so much sea ice that there isn't a reflective surface for the sun, and that heat doesn't go away. It just gets absorbed by the oceans. When that starts happening exponentially, then at that point we could ban all cars from the planet, but we're not going to stop it. So at that point, this is the decisive decade, and at some point within the next 10 years, we have to turn the majority of our resources to equipping our families to deal with the dramatic increase in extreme weather, because we've already seen a 50% increase in the severity and frequency of violent storms in the last 30 years. So what happens when it increases all that much more?
So when you talk that way, do you go to bed at night like having nightmares? Like, does it scare you?
Sure, of course it does.
Yeah.
The floods in Calgary were scary. The windstorms that swept the coast of BC a couple of years ago that took down trees and left people without power and fighting for water bottles at Walmart were scary. The fact that 300,000 people this year, mostly in low-lying Southeast Asian deltas, have lost their lives due to climate change is scary. We're in a pretty good position in Canada, actually. The predictions of what is going to happen, and if you actually start adding up what is already happening as a result of the increase of extreme weather, which we've already seen, it is really scary. And I think that's part of why we see this kind of almost turning away from the climate change issue, because there's a disconnect. If it's this bad, why aren't our politicians doing something? It must not be this bad. Or you just can't process it, oh, really, the majority of, oceans are going to be 30% more acidic within the next 2 years. I got to pack my kid's lunchbox.
But they're also saying, but Tzeporah, I want to take that vacation. I want to take my kids to Disneyland, or I want to do those kinds of things. And you're telling me I should reconsider and not
Well, that
do
has been the mistake of the climate movement, actually, was to focus on lifestyle. I mean, I do think as a parent it's important to change our lifestyles, to talk to our kids. It's nowhere near as important as putting pressure on our politicians to change the laws that will stimulate innovation and force big industry, like the oil sands, to reduce pollution. The oil sands alone, if allowed to expand to the extent that they're currently expanding, by 2020, production emissions from the oil sands will exceed the combined emissions of 85 nations. We have the single largest industrial project on Earth in the center of Canada. And that's the beast, that's the problem. And so all these people feeling guilty and not going to Disneyland is not going to impact them. But calling their member of parliament and telling them they want them to act, they want them to set climate targets and meet them, that will make a difference.
You're not going away. You're not backing down from this fight.
No, I think this is the fight of our generation.
All the best to you.
Thank you.
For this.